It was one of those nights where the world seemed to shiver, like the air itself knew something terrible was about to happen. The kind of night that burrows into your bones and makes you question every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of your eye. The rain was relentless, hammering down on my windshield, turning the desolate highway ahead into a blurry mess. I was driving home after a late-night meeting that ran longer than expected. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, but the storm had other plans. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and every time the lightning flashed, the whole world seemed to crack open for just a moment, revealing something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. That's when I noticed her, a lone figure huddled by the side of the road, soaked to the bone, her thumb extended. She looked desperate, vulnerable, like she had nowhere else to go. For a second, I considered driving past. Something in my gut told me to keep going. But against my better judgment, I slowed down, rolled down the window, and let the rain spill inside. "Need a lift?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice was barely audible over the storm. She didn't say anything. She just nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, water pooling around her feet. She was shivering, her hair plastered to her face. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel them on me, even though she never looked directly at me. The silence was suffocating. As I pulled back onto the highway, I tried to strike up a conversation, anything to break the tension. "Rough night, huh?" I said, glancing at her. But she didn't respond, just kept staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the edges of the seat like she was holding on for dear life. The rain wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse, and the wipers were struggling to keep up. I found myself glancing at her more often than I should, trying to make sense of the growing dread that was building in my chest. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, out of nowhere, she spoke. Her voice was low, raspy, like she hadn't spoken in days. "Turn left here," she said, pointing to a narrow, overgrown road that I hadn't even noticed until she mentioned it. It wasn't on my route, and everything in me screamed to keep driving, but I felt my hands turning the wheel, guiding the car down the deserted path. The road was barely visible, the trees closing in around us, their branches scraping against the windows like fingers trying to get in. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice trembled. She didn't answer. She just kept staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The further we drove, the denser the trees became, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness. I could barely see the road anymore, but she didn't seem to care. It was like she knew exactly where she was going. And then she whispered, so softly I almost didn't hear it, "To the scene of the accident." A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my hands clench around the steering wheel. "What accident?" I asked, my heart pounding. She didn't respond, just kept pointing forward, her finger trembling. Panic set in, and I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. "I'm not going any further," I said, my voice shaking. "You need to get out." She slowly turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw her eyes. They were dark, hollow, like black pits that seemed to swallow the light. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice barely more than a hiss. "Not yet." My blood ran cold. I threw the car into reverse, desperate to get back to the highway, to get away from whatever nightmare this was. But as soon as I started to back up, she let out a scream. It was the most horrifying sound I'd ever heard, like metal tearing, like 1,000 voices crying out at once. I slammed my foot on the gas, but the car wouldn't move. It was like something was holding it in place. I looked at her, and her form started to flicker, distorting, her face twisting into something that wasn't human. Her mouth stretched wide, wider than it should have been, and for a moment, I thought I could see something moving inside, something dark and writhing. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands shaking, bracing myself for whatever was going to happen next. But when I opened them, she was gone. The car was still, the night silent. I was alone. I don't remember how long I sat there, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, I managed to turn the car around and make my way back to the highway. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that she was still there, watching me. Every time I got in the car, I half expected to see her sitting in the passenger seat, those dark, hollow eyes staring at me. It wasn't until a week later that I decided I needed answers. I spent hours searching online, trying to find anything that would explain what had happened. Eventually, I stumbled across an old newspaper article. Local woman killed in tragic car accident on Highway 13. The headline read. The photograph beneath it made my blood run cold. It was her, the same woman I had picked up that night, her face unmistakable. The article described how she had died on a stormy night, trying to hitchhike her way home after her car broke down. She was never found. I don't know what happened that night, or why she chose me, but I haven't picked up a hitchhiker since. And every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there, her dark eyes watching me, waiting for the moment I forget, so she can come back. It was supposed to be our annual family road trip, a chance to escape the grind, to breathe in the open air and revel in the vastness of nature. My wife, Mary, had been planning it for months. The kids, Tim and Sarah, were counting down the days, and even I, not usually one for long drives, found myself looking forward to it. We were going to Yellowstone, just like we did every summer. It was a tradition, a little slice of normalcy in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. The day we left, everything was perfect. The sun was shining, not a cloud in sight, and there was a light breeze that made the air feel crisp. We piled into our old station wagon, waved goodbye to our neighbors, and hit the road. The first few days went by in a blur of tourist attractions and gas station snacks. Mount Rushmore, the Grand Tetons, those classic spots we visited every year. We had our usual campfire nights, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories. For a while, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. But then, somewhere along the way, things began to feel off. It was subtle at first, missing a turn, a road that seemed a little longer than it should have been. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the map being outdated. But there was something more to it. The forest around us felt dense, suffocating. The deeper we went, the more it felt like we were leaving the world behind. I remember the rest stop. We pulled over because the kids were getting restless, and I needed a minute to figure out where we were. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the parking lot. There was no one else around, not a single car. Mary and the kids stayed by the car while I fumbled with the map. It was supposed to be simple. Just follow the highway, turn onto the main road to Yellowstone. But none of it made sense. It was as if the roads had shifted, and suddenly, the route we knew by heart was unfamiliar. I thought it would be smart to rest for a bit, let the kids stretch their legs, and get back on the road once I got my bearings. We ate our sandwiches in silence, the unease settling over us like a thick fog. When we finally decided to get going, the car refused to start. I tried the ignition again and again, but it was no use. Panic started to creep in, but I kept telling myself it was just a minor problem, something I could fix. Night fell quickly. and without the car's headlights, the darkness felt like it was swallowing us whole. There was no moon, no stars, just pitch-black night. I could hear the forest around us, creaking and groaning like it was alive. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig felt like something lurking just out of sight, watching us. I tried not to let it get to me, but I could see the fear in the kids' eyes. They were clutching Mary, and she was looking at me, waiting for me to say something, to tell them it would be okay. I wanted to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in trouble. We spent that night huddled in the car. No one slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing right outside, just inches from the window, watching us. When morning came, I decided to venture out, see if I could find help. Mary insisted I take my phone, but there was no signal. I kissed her, told her I'd be back soon, and set off down the road. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I walked for what felt like hours, but I found nothing. No signs, no cars, no people. Just more trees. When I finally turned back, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I walked faster, feeling the weight of the darkness creeping up behind me. When I made it back to the rest stop, my heart sank. The car was there, but it was different. The windows were fogged up, the doors slightly ajar, like someone had been inside. I called out, but no one answered. My voice echoed, swallowed by the silence. I ran to the car, yanked open the door, but it was empty. No Mary, no Tim, no Sarah. Just the seats where they'd been sitting, the blanket we'd used to keep warm, still draped over the back seat. I stood there, staring at the emptiness, trying to make sense of it. They couldn't have gone far. I searched around the rest stop, checked every bathroom stall, every dark corner, but there was no sign of them. I spent the night shouting their names, my voice hoarse, my legs trembling with exhaustion. But there was nothing. No response. Just the endless oppressive silence of the forest. I don't remember how long I searched. Hours, maybe days. Time seemed to blur together. I kept thinking I'd hear their voices, that I'd see them coming around the bend, laughing, telling me it was all a prank. But they never did. The days stretched on, and I lost track of how many times I retraced my steps, how many times I begged for someone to find us. The car was my only shelter, and I hated it. Every time I sat inside, I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes in the dark, waiting for me to look away. I started to hear things. Whispers, faint and distant, like the wind through the trees. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I thought I was losing my mind, but then I heard it, clear as day. Sarah's voice calling out to me, "Daddy, help us!" I ran towards the sound, heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at my arms, but I didn't care. I had to find them. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing, just a clearing, and in the middle of it, an old rusted sign barely visible in the moonlight. It read, "Road closed." I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that sign, but I knew in that moment that we were never getting out. Something had brought us here, something that didn't want us to leave. I went back to the car, but I couldn't bring myself to get inside. I sat on the hood, staring into the dark, and waited. Years later, they found the car. I saw it on the news, covered in dust, exactly where I left it. They said it was abandoned, that the family was missing. They called it a mystery, speculated about what might have happened. But I know the truth. The forest took them, and it's still out there, waiting for the next family to lose their way. I was driving down Highway 66, a stretch of road I'd always heard about, but never had the chance, or the guts, to travel. It was late, The kind of late where the sky is inky black, and the only thing cutting through the darkness was the faint, hazy beam of my headlights. I hadn't planned on driving this late, but my GPS had rerouted me, and before I knew it, I was cruising down that famous, infamous highway. I'll admit, I felt a bit excited at first, like I was living out a piece of Americana. You hear so many stories about this road, the good, the bad, the supernatural. But as the miles passed, that excitement turned to unease. The road was practically deserted, just an endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the dark, with nothing but the occasional flicker of an old road sign to remind me I was still on the right track. Then, I saw it. A sign. Dead Man's Curve ahead. I chuckled nervously, like it was a joke that had overstayed its welcome. But as I approached the bend, a thick fog rolled in, dense and suffocating. My hands tightened on the wheel. I'd read about the dangers of Dead Man's Curve, but I figured it was all overblown. Yet, as the mist enveloped the road, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I had to slow to a crawl, squinting to make out the edges of the road. That's when I saw him. A figure appeared out of nowhere, standing dead center in the lane. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, the car skidding as I struggled to regain control. The figure was a young man, barely illuminated by my headlights, wearing a leather jacket, dark hair tousled, as if he'd been caught in a storm. But there was something off about him, something that made my heart thud painfully against my ribs. He just stood there, staring at me, not moving, not flinching. I was shaking, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. And then, in a blink, he was gone. I don't mean he walked away. I mean he vanished, as if the fog had swallowed him whole. I sat there, panting, trying to make sense of what just happened. I thought about turning around, calling it a night. But something pulled me forward. I don't know what it was. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness, maybe just pure, stupid adrenaline. I crept forward, every muscle tense, eyes scanning the fog for any sign of the man. A flickering light caught my attention up ahead, barely visible through the haze. It was a gas station, its neon sign buzzing weakly, casting a sickly glow on the old, rusted pumps. It looked like it had been plucked straight out of a different era, forgotten by time, and left to decay by the side of the road. Desperate for a break, and maybe a bit of reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind, I pulled in. The place was deserted, not a car in sight. But as I stepped out of the car, a figure emerged from behind the counter inside the station, an old man with a grizzled beard and sunken eyes. He nodded at me as if he'd been expecting me. "What brings you out here, son?" he asked, voice low and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. I hesitated, unsure how to even begin. I saw someone, a man, on the road, but he disappeared. The words felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth, like I was confessing to a bad dream. The old man's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly, a knowing glint in his eye. "You saw him, huh? The hitchhiker." My stomach dropped. "Hitchhiker? What do you mean?" He leaned forward, elbows resting on the counter, and told me a story. Decades ago, a young man died on this stretch of road, hit by a car while he was trying to hitch a ride. Since then, drivers passing through Dead Man's Curve have reported seeing him, always just before a fatal accident. Some say he's a warning. Others think he's trying to hitch a ride out of this place, but he never gets far. Folks call him the ghost of Dead Man's Curve, the old man said, his tone grim. "You're lucky you stopped when you did." I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I was sinking into quicksand, every word pulling me deeper into something I didn't want to understand. Has anyone ever picked him up? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. The old man's eyes darkened, and he shook his head. Those who try don't live to tell about it. He glanced out the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, writhing and restless. You should get moving. The fog doesn't lift until sunrise, and you don't want to be stuck here all night. I took his advice, paid for a gas top-up, and got back in my car. But as I drove away, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, as if eyes were watching me from the dark. I told myself it was just my imagination, the remnants of a creepy story sticking to my brain like tar. But then I saw it. In my rearview mirror, a flicker of headlights. They appeared out of nowhere, bearing down on me, fast. Too fast. I glanced back, and for a split second, I could make out the shape of a truck, an 18-wheeler, barreling down the highway, headlights blinding, horn blaring. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing. I swerved, nearly losing control, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. The truck was gone, but I could still hear it, the low, distant rumble of an engine, the hiss of air brakes, like a phantom chasing me through the fog. I floored it, praying I'd make it out of this stretch of road before whatever was out there caught up to me. I could barely see through the mist, but I didn't dare slow down. I drove like that for what felt like hours, until finally the fog began to thin, the headlights ahead piercing through like a lifeline. When I pulled into the motel parking lot at the edge of town, I stumbled out of the car, legs shaking, hands still clenched tight. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the highway stretching back into the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I haven't driven Highway 66 since that night, but sometimes late at night, I still hear it. The rumble of an engine, the screech of tires on asphalt, the faintest whisper of a horn blaring in the distance, and I wonder if I'm the only one who made it out.